Hi, everyone. Good evening. We're going to give it a couple more minutes to let a few more people join. People are still joining, so we're so excited to see everyone. Just a couple more minutes, and we can go ahead and get started.
And this is the moment, Crystal, when I start to rue that I have not made my home office as incredible as yours seems to be. Uh, um,
Oh, yes.
and some people have these incredibly elaborate Zoom backgrounds, and I confess I just did not I have not figured out how to do that either.
Okay, yes. Oh my gosh. Yes, this is where the magic happens, so I gotta make sure, that the magic will want to come and stay. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Crystal Moten. I am on the board of the Labor and Working Class History Association and also the chair of the Presenting Labor and Working Class History Committee. And so we are so excited to bring this book talk event, this double book talk event to discuss and celebrate and think about these wonderful books that acknowledge uh, and discuss labor and working class history. Before we get into the event, I wanted to thank the members of the committee, especially Patrick Dixon and Mike Rosenow, who have helped to plan this event, who helped to um, solidify the logistics of the event, and who really done a lot of work to make this possible. Before we get into the event, a couple of LAWCHA announcements. If you are not a member of LAWCHA, I really encourage you to join our ranks. We are a wonderful group of folks who care about not only labor and working class history, but the relevance of those important histories to today. And we know they're so important. Additionally, we have our biannual conference coming up June 12th to the 14th. That will be where I am in Chicago at the University of Chicago. The deadline to register is May 15th. If you go to lawcha.org, you can learn more about the conference program, the draft program so far. You can also learn more about lodging opportunities, which will be available through the university and then hotels in the Chicago area. Additionally, a new issue of Labor has just been put out. And so we encourage you to check out that new issue of Labor. The committee is working to plan some additional events, another book talk event, and then also we had announced that we would be having a works in progress workshop, but we will be postponing that a little bit to get a bit more interest and participation and to make sure what we plan meets the needs of all of you. So that will be happening, but a little bit later. So those are my announcements that I wanted to share. I am so pleased to be able to turn the floor over to Justin Jackson, who will moderate our book talk this evening. Justin is an author and historian of the United States, the US in the world, and global history. His book, The Work of Empire, War, Occupation, and the Making of American Colonialism in Cuba and the Philippines, is forthcoming, but you can pre-order it now, and it's really important that you pre-order books before they come out because they signal to the publisher, right, that the book needs to be there, and we know this book needs to be out, and it just shows the publisher that there is interest. So pre-order Justin's book. It's available now for pre-order through UNC Press. So thank you, Justin, for agreeing to moderate the panel, and I will turn it over to you. Oh, one other note, as Justin moderates the panel, if you have questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. We will collate them, make sure they get asked, but we're asking any questions or comments instead of raising your hand and unmuting, that you would put those in the chat and we will get them answered that way. So thank you all for coming. Justin, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Moten, and it's a pleasure to meet you. And thank you for the introduction. I'm really looking forward to the conference in Chicago. I think it's going to be exciting. It's an important moment, obviously, for labor historians and labor scholars to gather. Um, I'm also going to say I'm very excited about the new journal. As some of you may know, the journal has been redesigned, the cover, and some contributors are, I believe, here tonight. So very excited about that. So. Thank you so much. Folks, I am incredibly excited about the two books that we are going to discuss tonight. And I know usually these book tops are a single monograph at a time, but I actually think these books really speak to each other in a lot of different ways. Labor history, I would like to argue, global labor history especially, but not just that. I mean, they speak to the history of empire, of migration, maybe even the history of capitalism and can get us into problems of how labor history and the history of capitalism intersect. And that's just the beginning. So we're going to be talking about these two very remarkable and formidable books. I'll introduce our authors. First, we have Titas Chakraborty, who is the author of Empire of Labor, How the East India Company Colonized Hired Work with the University of California Press, published this year. Dr. Chakraborty is an assistant professor of history at Duke Kunshan University. Her publications cover labor, slavery, migration, and gender in early modern and early colonial South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And there is a lot to discuss in this book, so I'm really looking forward to it. Second, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Stacy Fahrenthold, the author of Unmentionables, Textiles, Garment Work, and the Syrian American Working Class, Stanford University Press, also this year, just out, these new books. Stacy Fahrenthold is Associate Professor of History and Middle East South Asia Studies at UC Davis, where she writes and teaches migration and refugee histories. Unmentionables is her second book. Her first book, Between the Ottomans and the Entente, the First World War in the Syrian and Lebanese diaspora, received multiple awards, including the Arab American National Museum's Evelyn Shakir Award in 2020. Congratulations. That's excellent. And I must say, as a new author, I am continuously impressed now that I finished a book with anyone who's written one book, much less two books. So I look forward to looking at the scholarship that each of you have published in addition to these texts. So really quickly, I wonder if each of you could just take a minute to summarize the main arguments and findings and maybe the contribution you think your book makes to labor history defined broadly, and perhaps just kind of take off from the title of your book, and just speak to what you think its contribution is relative to labor history. And if Titosh, if you wanted to go first, oh, I'm not sure if Titosh's signal is. Maybe as we're waiting for Titosh, would you like to go first, Stacy?
Yeah, I can
Okay,
I can jump in.
great.
Looks like there might be a connectivity issue. Titash, I don't want to skip in line. I'll go ahead. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's interesting because I'm really grateful to be engaging with this group because I come at this topic not as I'm not forwardly a labor historian. I'm actually a historian of migration and refugees and diasporas, Arab American diasporas specifically. And this was kind of like my foray into labor history, my first interaction with labor history. And I think the book sort of makes a couple of really compelling connections to labor history while also making the case for using migration history methods and social historical methods, kind of the ethnic history methods that I'm used to in pursuit of labor histories. So the book is about Syrians, Palestinians, and Lebanese who all came to the Americas between 1900 and 1934. The largest single industry, proletarian industry that the Arab American diasporas participated in during this period was the textile industry. So we have thousands of Syrians and Lebanese and Palestinians who were entering into the woolens companies, into broadcloth weaving, into silk weaving, garment work, and textile logistics, right? Peddling of textiles, embroidery, lace making, all sectors of this economy. And one of the arguments that I'm building here is that I'm thinking about what it means to think about the Arab American diaspora as having an industrial past. So one of the most pervasive stereotypes about Arab American history is that this is a diaspora that was all about merchants and shopkeepers and especially peddlers. And I really wrote this book because I observed that there were so many Arab American workers in various corners of the textile industry, and that these workers, moreover, were disproportionately, like most of them, were actually young women and girls. And so I wanted to write a labor history to sort of revise what I saw as like a stereotypical depiction of the Arab American past, which presaged and like assumed that there was no industrial past here. So I wanted to get into labor history for that reason. But I also wanted to tell a story that was kind of about gender and class and race and how they intersect. Because the people that I'm writing about, they are predominantly younger women and girls who are engaged in industrial work and who became what I call unmentionable because they had to navigate a strategic politics of visibility and invisibility in order to sort of um, press their claims as labor, but also to press their claims as women. So I could go on and on. I'm going to stop there. Just that's sort of an introduction to the book. It's got 5 chapters. It's transnational. It deals with U.S. history, but also sort of transnational Arab American diasporas. Looking forward to talking with y'all. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if we had a connectivity problem with Titas, but hopefully Titas has rejoined us. So I'm going to check here.
I don't see her yet. She may have logged out. I'm logging back in.
Okay, huh. Well, she was there and then kind of disappeared. So I'm hoping Titas will rejoin us. Until then, um, I wonder if you, oh, she's back. Okay, fantastic. Um, Titas, are you there?
Yes, I just got thrown out of Zoom and to restart the whole thing.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry about that. I think one thing I just mentioned, the reason I think it crashed, maybe not a good reason, but don't focus on my video or something like that. Like maybe that's
Uh,
the technical sort of overload or something like that, which doesn't quite work. I'm so sorry. I'm
no worries,
um,
no worries. We're glad you're here.
yeah.
So I was just asking if you,
Sorry, I can't hear you. Can you just repeat yourself? Can't hear you.
sorry, I was just going to ask if you could elaborate really briefly um, uh, the book's main argument and findings and contribution to labor history based on the book's title. Maybe you could start from there.
Yeah. Okay. So my book is basically argues that how that the English East India Company stay transform the experience and meaning of hired work or working for wages in Bengal, which is in the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent, in the period between mid 18th century and the early 19th century. So that's the main argument. And as you can see in the sort of title of my book, Colonization of Hired Work, what I mean by that is the systemic reduction of workers' ability to determine various conditions of work. Whether like what would be the wage, the time for work, um, the process of recruitment, etc. Um, through a number of processes such as elimination of competitors, creation of a centralized state by removing other competing governing powers, right? Especially the powers of the zamindars or bureaucrats who shared governing powers with the Mughal state. Then creation of laws that proscribed various practices of workers, creation of a centralized police force, which became the prime organ for recruiting and disciplining workers, and who both created and enforced these new laws, and also the introduction of foreign technology. So all this led to the transformation of the experience and meaning of hired work in the region. And in order to study this transformation, right, I begin so the book begins in the mid 17th century, a period from when the English East India Company had operated in the region and had been hiring thousands of workers locally. And I closely studied three or certain groups of workers, which are boatmen and silk reelers who were indigenous workers, but then also I study European sailors and soldiers. So that's the whole book.
And I totally appreciate it's very hard to summarize all of the many arguments that you both are making in these very substantial books that are intervening in a lot of different literatures. That kind of gets me to my second question. There's kind of I think for global historians, for labor historians, there's some familiar stories or subjects in each of your books. For Titash, I mean, perhaps a lot of us know about the role of, say, the East India Company in transforming the cotton and textile industry, right, in early modern India, and how that relates to the kind of the progress of British imperialism, as well as industrialization as a related process. Um, for Stacy Fahrenthold, I really enjoyed the first chapter on the Lord's textile strike, the bread and roses strike, in part because that was my introduction to labor history, looking at the IWW. Um, and yet you have such, I think, a different story to tell about that. What do you think is kind of going to be interesting and new, making the familiar unfamiliar? For labor historians in your respective books. If you could pull out kind of one thing. And go ahead, Titash, if you'd like. Just because
Okay,
not a
all
lot of
right.
it's okay.
So yeah, so as you mentioned, right, textile weavers have received a lot of attention, and they were at the heart of the story of deindustrialization of the region. So that explains it. But however, they did not comprise the majority of the workforce, and they were not directly hired by the companies, arguably until the 1780s, when the English East India Company started to register weavers. However, there was other aspects of the textile industry where we do see existence of pure hired work for a very long period of time, and this is where the silk reelers actually come in. But the silk reelers haven't received much attention at all. Um, when like one of the work that I do in the book is to clearly understand and explain what was the nature of the work, because when I started doing the work, and even now, right, I mean, there is not really even like an understanding of the exact nature of their work, which is more to say, like, how little these workers have been studied. But then there is also a big theoretical and historical significance in shifting our attention to silk readers, for example, because it allows us to then study artisanal work in relationship to other forms of wage work. Um, as I said, right, I mean, the wage workers were basically the majority of the workers. And secondly, and this is historically very significant, is that this is one sector of the textile industry, which is silk yarn production, that did not experience deindustrialization until the 1830s. So what happened to these workers, right? Well, for understanding that story, one has to then understand the fates of other hired workers in the region, right? And so, in other words, what I would say is that I'm adding to the story of deindustrialization in new ways by shifting focus to other workers who work for wages, and also included workers related to textile industry. So this is something that I would say is like new. But then there's also generally, I think, this is also sort of a contribution, because most of the studies of the weavers is also very much focused on the early colonial state, right? Whereas we really don't see a study of long-term transformations. And I think uh, what I do in the book is use all the methods of early modern historians. So my book is basically studying both the early modern period as well as the period of colonial modernity in South Asia. So I use multiple archives, right? So understanding a social formation with multiple jurisdictions, which is what early modern historians basically do, but they don't study labor. Um, and so yeah, and what that has done is that I have historicized one labor form, right, which is wage labor in one region, and shown its transformation, right, or how it can be so different in two different political and economic contexts, right? And also because of the methodologies that I've used, and this is again something new I'm saying, right? Even you don't really see that in studies of sort of silk weavers so much, or textile weavers so much, is that how labor historians can use indigenous sources while also studying um, labor in a colonized context.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, Stacy, I wonder if you have a perspective on a kind of making the familiar seem unfamiliar, in some way for labor students.
Yeah. I was just listening to Titosh and thinking that there are so many, we have very different they're very different projects, but they're very similar methodological concerns, which is really sort of like animating me right now. So thank you for the opportunity to listen. Um, I was thinking like probably you mentioned the Bread and Roses strike, which is where I start on chapter one, right? Because it's kind of like it's like the most iconic US history of the textile industry. It's also the most iconic and in some ways the only labor history of Arab Americans, with the possible exception of another martyr. Okay, so I write about John Ramey, who was martyred at the Bread and Roses strike. More on that in a minute. There's maybe one other person, one other Arab American labor history that has that sort of level of iconization as like the story of Arab American labor, and that is the death of a Yemeni farm worker in UFW at a UFW strike in the 70s. So what I'm trying to do with this book really starts with John Ramey, who, for those who don't know, he was the Syrian teenager who played a trumpet with the Syrian drum corps, participated in the Bread and Roses strike, was killed by bayonet while leading a demonstration across the bridge into the mill zone during that strike. It's a known labor history. It's a known history of Arab American labor. The sort of one of the contentions of the book, however, is that the sort of like there's been this tendency to sort of stand in, like have that story, the John Ramey bayoneting death from 1912, to be the history of Arab American participation in labor, in formal trade unions, in labor activism, right? And that's a story that in a lot of ways obscures just as much as it tells, because John Ramey is a young man, because he's male, because he appears kind of solo, right? When a lot of the activism that's happening around him is very collective work. One of the ways in which I make the John Ramey story strange is first by telling it, right? And then identifying it as kind of like the iconic idea of what Arab American labor history is about, but then also tracing how Syrian American workers who are largely left out of the larger history of labor radicalism, labor strikes in the textile industry, despite the fact that they're like perhaps the second or third largest ethnic group in many of these strikes from this time. And they get left out of these stories because of the kinds of archives that have traditionally been used to narrate strikes. So, by making recourse to indigenous sources, by making recourse to Syrian sources, the first half of my book really tries to track like a Syrian American labor politics before we have large groups of Syrians approaching formal labor leaders to join a strike action, right? So I argue that strike actions and Syrian participation in strike actions are the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of labor action and labor activism. One of the findings that making the Ramey story strange gets us is that Syrians who are organizing through mutual aid networks, through ethnic associations, and through their ethnic networks across multiple cities, they're sharing tactics, they're sharing methods, they're organizing jointly, they're joining one another's strikes. This is a story that's been told of other ethnic communities, but not so much about the Syrians. And that has consequences not just for Bread and Roses in 1912, but it also has consequences for the garment worker strikes that happened in the 1910s in places like New York City, which is the topic of chapter 3. It also has consequences for an emerging capitalist class that is also emerging in my book, an Arab American capitalist class, manufacturers who are starting to build their own factories in the Syrian diaspora, and who are trying to face off with and contest and in some ways constrain, lay claim to Arab labor, while also engaging with diasporic spaces. What I'm saying is that John Ramey is important. His story alone doesn't stand in for like Arab American labor history in toto, and that if we use Arab American sources in Arabic, through the methods of social history, we can understand why textile strikes in many different corners of this diaspora all start to look very similar to one another. And we can also start to understand the transnational business moves that Syrian American elites and manufacturers and capitalists make, especially in the 1910s and 20s when they're also globalizing their industries. Yeah, I hope that makes sense, but yeah.
Oh, definitely. And I think, that's one of the strengths of both of your works as global labor history, right? Obviously, the scale, the scope is global. It exceeds a particular national kind of container, right? And it brings into conversation different national or imperial kind of units of analysis. You're both doing that in really interesting and I think very exciting ways. Um, but I would say another commonality that I noted in each of your books is you're each dealing with workers and movement in some way. What are the kind of the economics of mobility, the kind of the social history of mobility? Uh, um, what is the kind of the cultural residue of workers' mobility in your different case studies? and I was really struck that for Titas, you use this concept of kind of mobility rather than migration, right? And I was wondering, well, is that because you're looking like in this kind of colonial context, or what is the word or category of mobility doing for you? Whereas I think for Stacy, it seems more like migration is the kind of heuristic that you're employing. And I was just wondering, I mean, given that I would argue these are very robust global histories, what is mobility or migration doing in your respective studies?
Titas, you're muted.
Sorry, go ahead if you can unmute, teacher.
Sorry, sorry about that. So, well, the reason I use the term mobility is to focus more on the physical act of moving, right? And how that is part and parcel of work, and then analyze what that entails. Now, here I must say that in my sources, right, only errant mobility creeps up in describing the workers as subjects, right? So, thus, workers are referred to as runaways, deserters, or fugitives, right? They're not referred to as migrants for obvious reasons, right? Probably in the imperial context, right? It didn't make much sense. But anyways, they don't appear as migrants, but they're constantly coming up as someone with sort of, stamped with errant mobility, runaways, deserters, fugitives. Um, Therefore, I had to really think through why moving the workers was so necessary and what problems that created, right? Um, and also, my book deals with workers who had very different scales of mobility, right? So some of the workers, such as the European sailors and soldiers, they moved across continents, while others did not move. So this is also part of my story, right? The Silk Relay. So the companies had great plans of moving them across to different parts within Bengal, but then also to other outposts in the Indian Ocean world. And the Silk Relay simply didn't move. So their mobility practices are also very limited. So in order to then understand these various scales of mobility all together, right? I mean, mobility then becomes a very important part of the analysis, right? Um, and I would say that one book that really helped me think about this question of mobility conceptually was Thomas Nail's The Figure of the Migrant. Now this is like for a book on of political philosophy, and his book is very like the history that he deals with is very Eurocentric, but then still conceptually it was helpful for me.
Oh, excellent. And I mean, you have so many fascinating stories, folks, that are worth looking at that to me really resonate in other kind of imperial and colonial contexts of workers being subjected to forced mobility in some cases, but also using relative mobility themselves as a form of individual resistance or escape or exit or organizing. So Stacy, I wonder if you could talk about that, like why migration and maybe why not mobility? Like what is the term doing for you in the case of not just Syrian workers, but also Syrian merchants, Syrian capitalists, Syrian entrepreneurs?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And first, I just want to plus one the recommendation of Thomas Nail's work. I enjoy this work, and I've assigned it to my students, and it always confounds and also animates a very good conversation. So it's very, very interesting that way. Um, it's interesting because, like, I was trying to think of like, why is it that I prefer this term migration rather than mobility? Because I do also write about mobilities. And I don't have the perfect answer, but I do have a couple of different ways to think about this. Part of what I'm arguing about the Syrian diaspora is that there's a certain amount of direction that is happening The labor economy in some ways is being increasingly directed by Arab American, merchants, employers, manufacturers who um, begin to assert more sort of begin to actually shape where Syrian migrants move, how they move, where they work when they arrive, and are actually sponsoring them through the migration regimes that existed at the time, right? And so part of the story is a bunch of Syrian and Lebanese migration agents who work in places like Geneva and I'm sorry, Genoa rather, and Marseille and New York City, and Veracruz, in Mexico, and who are actually directing workers in particular ways and connecting them with employment, right? So part of perhaps why I prefer thinking this through in terms of like migration is because engaging with the migration regimes that were emerging right around the year 1920 was a part of the labor economy, and there's actually an entire supply chain because a lot of these goods are also import-export kinds of goods. They're white goods that are also being directed through traffic, right? Through maritime ports. And there are Syrian importers and Syrian merchants and Syrian jobbers and Syrian immigration agents who are all kind of working to direct the traffic, whether we're talking about goods or workers. And they're doing so in a way that over the course of 20 years or so, they have more control over where people go and what kind of work they do. The other reason I guess that I use this term migration is that before 1920, there's this very clear, like before 1920, Syrian workers tended to be moving around the Americas, right? And not just between the Middle East and the Americas, but across the Western Hemisphere, in pursuit of work, in pursuit of economic strategies, in pursuit of just, resettling with family, this kind of thing. And the travel was more cyclical and circular, and casual is not the right word, but less about point A, point B kinds of migration. That changes after 1920, again, because the United States in particular, which is one of the sites where this book is located, is seeking to head off, stymie new immigration, right? And also seeking to sort of cut some of the ties that exist between Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and their respective diasporas. So in some ways, some of the people that I write about, they might have left the Middle East thinking of themselves as mobile labor, and they lived that kind of life. And then after World War I, that's when they become immigrants, right? And they become immigrants by virtue of not their mobility, but their immobilization by the law. So those are a couple thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. And that's fascinating to think about the intensification of state control of labor mobility that's happening in the Syrian case. But that's also happening in the case of the East India Company, right? In a powerful way, which you show Titas. I mean, literally, as the company becomes the company state, right? It becomes the colonial state. You document so richly, right? How you move from a decentralized political regime of the zamindars, right, where there's a distribution of power, right, that regulates labor or fails to regulate labor, towards a centralization of state power by the end, where you get more control of workers' mobility. So that's excellent. Um, uh, there's so many more questions I'd like to have. I wish we had like 2 hours. Maybe before we kind of collect questions from attendees here, maybe instead of asking the history of capitalism question, I feel like we sort of uh, um, danced around the edge of that. Instead of that, I wonder if I could ask this question. I mean, I think what's so rich about these studies is in many ways, I mean, you're using exciting new kind of global techniques, global history techniques. Yes, there's gestures to the history of capitalism that's very strong in both of these texts, I think. But in a kind of old-fashioned new labor history or social history method, you're also really concerned with workers' culture. And maybe it's not like the traditional, in every sense, working class culture that we used to study, workers in the workplace, workers in their particular communities. You've globalized those questions, but you're still looking at cultural resources for workers and how that develops over time and how that influences them politically in their activity. I wonder if you could tell us like what was like the most surprising element of kind of workers' culture that you discovered or in your research or that you write about? I mean, you both use these resources so well. Looking at, say, Syrian feminists, working class feminist columns, their newspaper, their columns, their journalism. Titas, I loved the discussion you have of the problem of salt, right? And the kind of salt as both, yes, it's a material resource for workers, but it's symbolic. It registers in culture as well as kind of the boat work itself, boat work and boat mobility. So maybe it's not those elements of culture you found really interesting, but if you could just kind of share with us a sampling of something you found interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are several examples. Like the illegal salt trade was probably one of my really exciting finds because, salt trade itself just comes up in the language of illegality, right? From the colonial accounts. And especially there are works on salt trade, but illegal salt trade and how the companies sort of manage salt trade, but there's no mention of boatmen in that literature, right? And it's mostly about how the company runs its private merchant. But then when I started doing the work, I was like, oh, a lot of what is happening in the early 18th century is that the boatmen were illegally sort of carrying salt. And it was fascinating. And then I really dug into like why would boatmen want to carry salt? And then it came out in other sort of literature, right? How this whole right to trade, I wouldn't say right, but this like privilege of trading is part of the identity of boatmen that comes up in really popular Vaishnavite literature from the 18th century. And these are all sort of indigenous literature, and which then allowed me to think like, oh wow, why this is so important. And it was very important, right? I mean, who would have expected a whole full-scale strike, right, in 1734 because the boatmen were not allowed to carry salt. Like they had to completely, the English East India Company had to completely cancel their entire inland expedition precisely because the boatmen wouldn't sort of move, or they were just running away with from the boats, especially the oarsmen. So that's one very important find and very exciting find. And another thing I would say, like, one of the things that my book does is to really understand European workers as part of the Asian labor market, which is very sort of interesting for me as well. And so there were a lot of examples, right, of soldiers converting to Islam to seek protection from Mughal armies once they have run away, right, from European companies. And so this was also very interesting. And also, I mean, I do that in the book if you look at it. While thinking about Europeans as part of indigenous sort of social imagination, I really found out a lot of icons of European soldiers in the terracotta temples, right? So how the soldiers are actually represented, the ships are represented, the maritime world of work is represented, which was like absolutely fascinating for me. I would just end by saying, like, another thing, like another strain that the book actually follows from the archival sort of material is the entitlement of workers for food money. And this was there for boatmen, this was there for also European sailors and soldiers, right? I mean, how important, essential food money was. And there was a full-scale strike in the Bengal waterfront, right, of the in the entire fleet of the Dutch East India Company in 1733, where this is most important, Bengali sailors and European sailors together, like the entire fleet had sort of, like gotten together and struck war, precisely because they were all angry about the VOC's delay in giving out food money. And I don't think, like, there are at all. Like there are very few instances, if, and by late 18th century, actually none, where European sailors and Bengali sailors together would be striking war. And the interesting word that they used while, they were sort of leveraging their demand is that they needed bakshish. So the bakshish is basically a Hindustani term, which is also part of Bengali lexicon, to say, like, food money, right? And so the Dutch sailors were not even using the word kostgeld. So this is the term, right, that they're sort of using while they were making their central demand for which they actually struck war. So, yeah, so there were several aspects of this sort of, the unearthing the cultural world.
I dare say, Titas, you're being very modest. I mean, there is so much rich analysis of poetry, of literature, of statue kind of
Yeah.
work. Like it's incredible, and I think it speaks to both the depth of this kind of early modern, kind of sometimes pre-European, right? Colonization era research, but also like the what I think is one of the strengths of the subaltern studies method, which is to
Yes.
look for kind of pre-national sources of nationality, cultural sources there. So, and I'd also say, folks, this is not just a study of the East India Company. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, is in here as well, right? So it's really a very comprehensive study of the whole space and process of colonization. So sorry to keep us waiting, but Dr. Fahrenthold, if you could tell us, one thing, a cultural artifact or cultural residue or cultural resource that surprised you and you weren't expecting as you kind of made your way through the research.
Yeah, thank you. I was smiling, bakshish is also used in Arabic, where it comes from, the shared Persian. And in that context, it refers to like a tip or, more colloquially, a small bribe. Um, so it's interesting, the etymology of this word. Um, so, when I set out to write this book, I thought I was going to be writing, or I anticipated or kind of wanted to write a sort of labor v. capital kind of style of history. And what I ended up with was something very different than that. I mean, there is some of that labor v. capital, strike after strike kind of vibe to the book, but something that was surprising to me. Well, not so much surprising, but something that was an unexpected interest that I developed as I wrote it was the degree to which many of the workers that I was writing about were contending not just with white bosses, but with like their own diaspora politics, the cultural politics of diaspora. And so labor contests also became places for showdowns over Syrian diaspora, cultural norms, gender norms, paternalism, patriarchy, racial respectability. And it was young women and women workers in particular who always ended up in the position of sort of simultaneously contesting the politics of labor exploitation, like in the factory setting, in the industrial setting, but simultaneously contending against the diasporic nationalisms, the paternalism, the sort of, on feminist grounds. One example of this, I write about a series of Arab American feminists who were writing in New York City during a period of several ILGWU uprisings that Syrians were participating in that decade in the 1910s. And something that these Arab American feminists begin to articulate is they begin to invert some of the negative stereotypes that pervade in Arab American culture and Middle Eastern culture in general, like stereotypes that began in Lebanon find their way to New York. And then we see Arab American feminists who are turning them on their heads. One of my favorite examples of this involves an Arab American feminist who champions women workers emasculating men, sort of reinventing a stereotype about Arab men who are more interested in carousing in cafes than in doing sort of honorable industrial labor, and then pairing that or like creating a foil where we have the sort of like women industrial worker who is the rent payer in her household versus the sort of idle man who is emasculated but through his idleness. And so some of these are tropes that we see in other immigrant communities as well, and they're connected to them. There's also scripts about women's work in industrial textiles as like connected to sexual threat. There's an entire many of these Syrian manufacturers are trying to put forth an industrial culture that they're calling industrial patriotism, where they're essentially laying claim to the right to compel Syrian women's labor as like our women's labor, right? And so there's these like racial respectability tropes that are really based on assigning a particular role to Syrian women whose labor is owned not by her household and not by her personally, but by the ethnic community. And then you see a generation of Syrian and Lebanese and Palestinian young women who are contesting these things on feminist grounds, anti-nationalist grounds, socialist grounds. Some of them are grabbing onto like the progressives language and the language of the social settlement houses, and they're really just taking these scripts and making their own politics. And something that's striking about it is it's sometimes implicitly and sometimes quite explicitly an anti-nationalist politics. My first book was all about nationalisms, so in some ways this was surprising to me, but also very satisfying after writing a book about men who espoused long-distance diasporic nationalism, and now here we have their sisters and their cousins and their daughters really just throwing rocks at that sort of politics. So labor scripts, the culture of labor contests, the discourses of labor contest become discourses about how do we contend with racial respectability politics in a 1920s context within the Arab American community. Probably my favorite part of this chapter is writing about these Arab American feminists. And if I could do an entire book on this group, I would.
Oh, please do. Please find a way. Well, this is excellent. I could go. I could, I so enjoyed reading these. I could definitely give more questions, and we could be here to the wee hours of the morning or the night, depending on where you are on the globe. But a couple of folks had questions in the chat, and I wanted to kind of run through them. The first one from Kenyon Zimmer. Is regarding the Syrian workers' kind of politics and oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please. Jump right in.
Um, yeah, okay, sure. I was just waving hello. Titas and I went to grad school together for a bit.
Oh.
So, yeah, Stacy, I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the ideology of Syrian workers insofar as it can be sort of recovered from the evidence. Because in particular, all the unions they're heavily involved with, like the IWW and the LGW, are very leftist, right, syndicalist or socialist. And do you find engagement with sort of those elements of those unions on the part of Syrian workers and strikers, or is that there? Is that recoverable?
Thank you for the question. For sure, it's there. Syrians struck with all three of these unions multiple times between the 1910s and the 1930s. Most famously Bread and Roses, but also, the 1913, 16, 18, so on and so forth with ILGWU. The ACW, is that the Clothing Workers of America, the folks in Boston? Yeah, they're there too, where they're striking alongside their Armenian co-workers. And there are also, syndicalist organizations, or rather like sort of leftist socialist syndicalists, I don't think they would call it there are organizations that I don't think they would call themselves anarchists, but some of the people participating in them might be flirting with those politics. And some of them are, placed under investigation, and some of them are subject to the Red Scare. And if for this reason and many more, it's very difficult to get more than a fragmentary history of Syrian and Lebanese and Palestinian leftism from this time. This is one of the things that, like, in this book, I really wanted to do, right? And I got, as far as realizing that if I wanted to narrate this history from an Arab American perspective, I needed to use the Arab American sources. One of the challenges of doing that is that there's a lot of community-based collecting, a lot of counter-archival materials in this diaspora. It's one of the superpowers of studying Arab American history. But a lot of those racial respectability narratives, they are a product of those counter-archival collections, right? Which were concerned primarily with establishing the right to remain in America. So what I'm saying is that you can find, or I have found, sort of the partial collections of socialist and leftist Arab American reading rooms, or a newspaper called The Dawn, with all of the sort of trappings of what that title implies. That was published for 5 or 6 years, and so you have all these like tantalizing bits of like what gives you sort of a look into the fact that there are these sort of radical groups of people workers of radical politics who are in a lot of ways working amongst the Syrian community, but also interacting with mostly Italians and Jews, in all of these places, striking alongside them, translating their letters and their statements and their missives, giving strategic, like, organizing tips, those kinds of things. But it's, one of the things that it was one of the goals of my book to sort of like get as much of that stuff into a coherent narrative as possible. But one of the things that was a persistent challenge writing this book was the fact that a lot of this stuff is unmentionable. People looked at each other, they clearly interacted, they clearly engaged in solidarity, they clearly did political action. They were clearly seen and heard, but there's not a lot in terms of archives. So the book is kind of a start in that direction, but it also leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And that's both the thing that I think is really interesting about the book, but also one of the things that most frustrated me when I was writing it.
And I wonder if we could kind of turn that question around and send it to Titas. Is there any way to even think about the mentality of these workers, the boatmen, the silk reelers, maybe the European sailors and soldiers who are interacting with these other workforces at different times? Is there any way to even think of their activity or the records of their thinking in terms of politics and ideology? Or is it pre-political? Is it pre-ideological? Like how do you even conceptualize that in a book where I would argue you're not really looking at like a working class for itself necessarily at every point. There are strikes, there is collective action, but there's from what I recall, there's not a lot of like unions or political parties at this stage, right?
Yeah, that's correct, right? I mean, there are no political parties, and but then so here's the thing. I would say that the way we can get, but there is politics, right? I mean, but one of the things that I use very extensively in the book is to use vernacular religious poetry. And the vernacular religious poetry, the poets came from this sort of milieu, right? I mean, most of them were upper caste, um, but then also not everyone was Brahmin also. And then there's a lot of boatmen's songs that I use, which were all written or composed by boatmen basically, and most of the boatmen came from a wide variety of lower castes, but not from one particular caste. So in any case, the reason I'm going into this is there is and also the religious poetry were extremely performative in nature. So these are not written texts per se. These are constantly performed and change through the process of performance. So there's no sort of distinction between orality and written culture in if you read this sort of text. And so there is a lot of participation of the workers in the creation of this text. So they do show the politics of the period, right? And it does give you a sense, and this is also why while by reading it, I kind of understood what is the politics behind the sense of entitlement to different forms of wage payments, right? Um, and so this is not as you were saying, right? I mean, or as Stacy has very in details discussed, right? A form of socialist or anarchist politics, but then this is still a politics which is rooted in a sense of what is a just sort of state. What and the justness is understood in terms of reciprocal obligations. Um, so, um, but um, but the reciprocal obligation is not just a kind of something that the state is doing for the workers, but it is also the pact on which the state is actually present, right? So this is also the political whole is kind of constructed through this reciprocity. And this is why it is so important. As I said, these are performative texts. So the worker who's listening to it, right? He also finds a lot of importance in hearing that the workers get a reward, right? They're honored. Um, so yeah, so in that sense, I would say this is political. I don't think it is pre-political because these texts are basically talking about what is zamindari, what is holding together a zamindari, right? And yeah, and in there, the payment of the the rewards or welcoming the workers, giving him different forms of honorariums are very central. Takes up quite a bit of space.
And wonderfully shows, I think, how dangerous it is to assume that the EIC and the British Empire is like all powerful consistently or something, it's actually extremely weak, its power is partial and limited. And I think you do an excellent job of showing, how the EIC is a zamindari. It is essentially acting in the same kind of political
Yeah.
capacity of these local states under the late Mughal Empire, right? Like, uh,
Yeah, yeah, and how that then transform because the accrual of power. I think what my book does is the accrual of power, and simultaneously with the accrual of power, how the EIC is intervening in changing workers' culture, right, or workers' politics, because it does evolve from being a zamindar into the all-powerful state, right? And then eliminates all other zamindars and its competitors as well by the early 19th century. So it's very important to understand the company as a changing entity and a changing state entity, which, yeah.
Mm. Well, we're a little over the 8 o'clock hour, and so I'm gonna invoke my awesome powers as the executive to ask if we could end with a brief answer to a brief question, which is if there are any ABDs, any graduate students attending, or faculty advisors of ABDs, what would be like the one bit of advice that you think is crucial for someone trying to do global labor history who has mostly read not global labor history literature but wants to do a global labor history project? Like, what is the one bit of advice for conceptualizing a project, doing research, or figuring out how you're going to tackle a research problem? Based on your experience, could have you learned that you could dispense? I know that's a difficult question, but um,
I could take that one pretty quickly. I will present myself as a cautionary tale, if that helps. When I was dissertating, I knew, I was writing a slightly different project. I was writing about print culture, Arab American print culture in the Americas. So I wanted to write about Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians in the Middle East, as well as New York City, Boston, or New York City, Sao Paulo, and Buenos Aires, which was, of course, a very ambitious project, and something that my dissertation advisor was consistently trying to convince me to do and succeeded eventually, but which was some of the best advice that I would pass on to someone who wants to do a global history of any kind, is to find and value smallness somewhere. Find the limits, find the way that you're going to structure your study in a way that does not mean that you're doing everything, right? So, for instance, Unmentionables, it didn't start as a dissertation, but it is a global history, right? It's got Boston, it's got, Lawrence, it's got New York City, it's got Veracruz and Tampico, Mexico. It's got the US-Mexico borderlands, Madeira, Yokohama, Manila, et cetera, right? So it does have a global reach, this book. But one of the ways that I structured it was to follow a particular supply chain, to follow a very specific production, from raw fibers into threads, into cloth, into garments, and into the peddlers' suitcases as they did the logistics work at the other end of the supply chain, and I structured the study that way. So even though it's a global history, it's also simultaneously a history that's it's, at least attempting to be very clear about its limits, right? And I think that working with grad students, I think global labor history, global migration history, histories of global scale are incredibly rewarding, very, very interesting. But it becomes all the more important to frame the project around a particular network or a particular business or a particular commodity or a particular archive, maybe. And that can be achieving that balance can be challenging. The last thing I'll say, though, is that I think it is miles more interesting to write a history that is based on the actual observable characteristics and shape of the history you want to tell than it is to base a history in a national container, because there's nothing more artificial than that.
oh, excellent. Yeah, T-Tash, yeah.
Okay. So Stacy has done a very good job, but I'll just talk about what are the things that I found most challenging, and I probably would start from that because I guess the most challenging part was also the most important turning points in my work. And so for me, doing labor history, and when I really look back, and it took 10 years, right? I mean, more. So at the process of writing it, or even researching, I think the most difficult part was to reconstruct the work process. I mean, it took me 6 months to figure out how the boats moved, right? And um, like I was rereading so many works of how silk was being reeled, right? So I guess like these technical details are very, very important because once we understand that, it really makes sense other aspects of the culture, right? And I can't emphasize on this much. Like, you do not understand what is the bargaining power of the workers unless you understand this. What is the impact of collective action? What is the nature of collective action? Oh, another thing, even for studying European sailors and soldiers, it took me a long time to figure out the recruitment process and the payment process. And and then I'm like, why are they running away when they actually owe money? When the company actually owes them money, like, are they completely irrational? Then I realized, like, oh, the companies were paying back their debtors in Europe, right? So once they actually ran away, that time is theirs. Whatever they earn from the other companies, they don't need to send it back to Europe. So this is their own money. Like, it makes absolute sense that they would run away. So in any case, but figuring out how the payment process actually was structured was very important to then understand why they're running away. Right? This is one example. So I guess like finding out all these technical details is very, very important, precisely because that gives a very solidified nature to the story, right? I mean, yeah. And the second thing I would say is like, which I think like Stacy probably has mentioned a number of times, is especially if you're looking at parts of the world which is not sort of, let's say, like, in Europe or North America, right? I mean, so it's very important to use various kinds of archives. And by that, I don't only mean, right, indigenous sources, which is very important, but then also to use um, sort of multiple archives. So even if you're using European archives, try to use, like, other archives, like who else are here, right? And which then goes back to Justin's sort of comment earlier, is that I have really utilized both the methods of history from below, but also subaltern history. And I took them very seriously because, you know, and there is a difference, right? History from below is not subaltern history. And some of my teachers, right, have been very influential in all that. I still remember when I finished my work in Dutch archives, and it took me a lot of time to actually study 17th century Dutch. And I was back in Calcutta trying to, like, narrate to my old professor Ratnavali Chatterjee, like, these are the things that I have actually found, etc. And then she was like, are you using indigenous sources? Are you using indigenous sources? How are you going to read this if you don't read the 17th century Bengali sources? Because you wouldn't be able to understand what the companies are sort of experiencing. Try to read the East India Company archives in the light of indigenous sources. And this were her words. And I think I benefited a lot from that. So I would say that, like, which is probably going to be a bit daunting, but I think, like, start thinking it from the beginning of your project. Then probably it won't be that daunting.
Well, it is daunting, but it seems that way at first. But I have to say, I mean, both of you execute these projects so beautifully, from the multiple archival bases to looking at change over time in multiple settings over time. It's incredibly rich, both as global history that is rooted in very specific places. Even we're getting into like how a Syrian factory in New York City is laid out, like how these boats function and what they look like, and the different functions of boatmen on the boat, right? I mean, there's a really wonderful integration of the kind of the practical, technical elements of the work process and the politics of work at a global scale. And I think that's exactly what we should be trying to be do with global labor history. So, folks, we're like 18 minutes over time. Again, with two books, I think we could definitely make this an hour and a half or 2 hours. But unless there's some really, really urgent questions where people want to jump in, I think um, we might call it around at this point. Thank you so
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Let's clap it up and give it a hand. This was such a wonderful, wonderful dual book talk. Learning from you, Stacy, and from you, Titas, and then Justin with your wonderful questions, pulling everything together. Learned so much. And if you have not purchased these wonderful books, if you have not had a chance to do so, please, 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 please get these books so you can continue to engage in the discussion and the conversation that their works are engendering. So thank you so much for participating in this book talk event, and thank everyone for coming out tonight. As I noted, we'll be having another book talk event, and we'll be hosting a works in progress session. Also, go to LAWCHA.org to become members and also find out about our 2025 conference, which will be in Chicago, hosted at the University of Chicago. You can register until May 15th. So thank you all for your participation, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or
And
evening.
I just want to say, like, thank you so much for
Yes,
having me here. It was very exciting. Like, this is a group that, I really value a lot, the opinion of this group. And yeah, it was absolutely my pleasure to actually be here. Thank you so
thank
much.
you.
You're
Yes,
welcome.
thank
Thank
Thanks
you.
you.
to Crystal and to Faith and Patrick and everyone else on the call.
Justin, yes.
Thank you so much,
Oh,
Crystal.
of
Thank you
course,
all.
Justin, for
Thank you.
doing
Great to
this.
connect with you.
And Joe, I have
And
to talk with you soon.
and I do want to thank Eileen and other folks for resuming this book talk activity that LAWCHA does. I think it's a real resource for labor historians in the States and abroad that we should definitely support and continues.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
everybody. Have a good
All
evening.
right.
Thank you, Chris.
Good
Thank you.
Bye.
evening. Take
Take care.
care. Bye bye.